Welcome again to CivilNet. It's May 6th, parliamentary elections in Armenia, and the polls will close in about an hour. We're speaking now Yerevan time around 7 o'clock. My guest again is Richard Giragosian, and about 51% of voters had voted as of about an hour ago, which is kind of a low turnout given Armenian elections. 8 o'clock, polls close, and then whoever is inside the polling station stays. Whoever is outside the polling station can't go in, and that's when it gets fun. It's been an interesting day, and there was a kind of historic press conference just a little while ago where the former President Levon Ter-Bedrosian, head of the Armenian National Congress, Vartan Oskanian, who's number 2 on the Prosperous Armenia ticket, had met at the Political Scientists Union and talked about the egregious violations and a major call on everyone to cool it. What do you think?
Well, I think historic is the right term to use, and in fact, not just historic, but a very positive sign in terms of actually adding enhanced pressure on the system itself. Because unlike past elections in Armenian history, this isn't just the opposition crying foul. This is actually others within the ruling coalition pointing out that in terms of irregularities and abusive behavior, it's unacceptable. And what this represents is actually a positive development in terms of greater scrutiny. But unfortunately, we also see we're entering a new stage. As the election and the polls close, we will see the ever-tempting period of vote count, where if we look at Armenian political history, sudden and spontaneous outages of electricity occur in certain key areas.
And so suddenly lots of people show up to vote. The numbers suddenly increase.
And usually muscle-bound, thick-necked young people.
It's amazing how this process that was really all calm most of the day. One of our reporters just called it and said he had his telephone grabbed out of his hand and was asked to leave, and of course didn't.
Well, in fact, the sun's going down, but passion and tension is increasing. And I do expect even a greater degree of tension and violence as the polls close. As early election results start coming in, we may also see increased friction in terms of reacting to initial reports.
It seems as if the party heads are already speaking up in order to try to prevent extreme reactions.
Prevent and preempt, but unfortunately only some of the party heads. We also see others within the Republican Party and other camps not quite being helpful or as constructive as they should be.
As we speak, the head of the Prosperous Party, Ghazarian, is in a press conference with the head of the Tashnaksutun list, Vahan Hovanesyan, and the expectation is that they're going to be making the same calls. One of the reporters asked President Ter-Bedrosian in the earlier press conference, why is it that you think that the Republicans and Prosperous that have not been at odds for years, why is it that this is now such a tense situation? And his answer was because Republicans haven't learned to actually compromise and deal. And this is coming from a man who has been called the opposition now for 3 years. The environment over the last 3 years has been really difficult between the ruling parties and the traditional opposition. How do you think it's going to be going into tomorrow and the rest of the 7-month period until the presidential election?
Well, unfortunately, it's beyond prediction because in many ways this is based on personality and, more importantly, egos. In terms of friction, in terms of power sharing is a very difficult concept in Armenia because it infers compromise and consensus. And this is the art of politics. But unfortunately, politics in Armenia is more a hobby, less an art form. And in this sense, we do see worrisome trends, yes, but also a challenge. In other words, whoever's elected and whoever wins in terms of problems and in terms of expectations and promises, this is going to be a very difficult task for the new parliament in terms of meeting expectations, delivering on their promises, and solving fundamental problems, widening disparities of wealth and income, economic crises after crisis, etc.
And the scene has really changed. If up to now the Republican Party perceived opposition as a bunch of little, not very powerful parties. It's now going to have to deal with a former partner that's now turned into a serious competitor.
Exactly. And more than that, in a positive way, this will force a higher level of debate and true compromise. But at the same time, we do see expectations of reform, perhaps, assuming a new context, a greater political battle. It's not a question of political will, because we don't have much political will, but of political necessity. So in this way, it's a contribution, and it's a positive development. But overall, I wouldn't envy those entering this new parliament. And especially with presidential elections hanging over everyone's head, there's a greater context of political posturing.
And there's been so much at stake for exactly in the run-up to those presidential elections. The sitting president, a popularly elected president, who didn't have to head his party list, who in most countries in the world would not have headed his party list, did so. President Sarkisian heads the Republican Party list, and so he has a whole lot more at stake than just electing a parliament.
Well, even more than that, if we look at the two Sarkisians, both the president and the prime minister, this election, in my opinion, is a test of their personal credibility and honor. Because these two men, as officials, are publicly on the record for promising and pledging greatly improved elections, and they should be called to account no matter what happens. Secondly, the other difference that we see is the lesson from Armenia, in that there's a big difference between ruling a country and governing a country. And it's a time now for statesmen, not strongmen.
Well, may God hear your voice, my son, my grandmother would have said. And what happens throughout the night and tomorrow is going to be an indication of whether, as you say, this continues to be a battle of egos and individual strong men, or whether this really turns out to be a very difficult battle for governance.
Well, what's at stake too is the future of Armenia and what kind of country we will have.
What is also at stake, I think, in many ways, is both the attitude of the international community that's kind of already at the point where they're saying, 20 years, enough of this already, and the generation, the independence generation, that wants to believe and hope and engage and is really looking askance at these elections and thinking, is there room for me?
And in this way, there's no more room for excuses.
There's no more room for excuses. Richard Giragosian said that, and we will continue to talk to Richard throughout this election period, maybe even later tonight, depending on how things play themselves out. This is CivilNet. Thank you for following us, and follow CivilNet again for more election news and analysis.